Hi, thanks so much for joining me today. Hope you're doing well. This is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. J.P. Moreland is such a wonderful teacher, and he's a wonderful speaker. He's come to our church in the past, and what an author. I can't even imagine how he has the time. Here he's been a professor, and he's been a scholar doing a lot of research, but his writing is just amazing. And so this is one of his books that he's written. It's a 2009 book, so it's not new, but boy, I tell you, nothing in this book is out of date. It's so good. Now, he wrote another one that sounds a little bit like this one. He wrote The God Conversation, and I've done a couple podcasts on that one. I haven't done any podcasts on this one. This is called The God Question, and it's subtitled An Invitation to the Life of Meaning. And so he's really aimed this book, I would say, more for either a new Christian who's not so sure about what he's doing, or maybe for a non-Christian who's kind of curious about what it means to live a Christian life, what it's all about. And so on the back cover it says, maybe it's time to give authentic Christianity a fair hearing. And so Moreland talks about things like, how can you know God exists? Can you have an intimate relationship with God? What does a 21st century disciple of Jesus look like? And things like that. So I want to start in his first section, and we'll just kind of work our way through the book as we do different podcasts. But he starts off with something kind of startling, but I think we all know it. He says, in the mid-1980s, hard evidence revealed that something was seriously wrong with the American way of life. It said there'd been rumors since the 1960s, but finally it became public knowledge. Now he says there's been more evidence in the 20-plus years since then that are echoing that. So he said, what am I talking about? What are the causes and symptoms that have hindered people from facing the problem and overcoming our dilemma? He said, let's look at this. He goes back to a 2006 issue of The Economist. And it was interesting. The magazine you think of as dealing with economic issues, but this one, apparently a December '06 issue, was dealing with happiness. And it said that must have been of great concern to the editors because it's not really a pop psychology magazine. So they did all sorts of research. Based on research data, they came up with the conclusion that people in affluent countries, now you ready, have not become happier as they've grown richer, as they've had more leisure time, as they've had this amazingly high standard of living. I think we know that down deep, don't we? That you look around and you say, well, we've had more success, we've had more wealth, we've had better education, and you look around, you're going, well, why aren't people happier? And they said in 2005, they did another study, another group on American happiness, and came up with similar findings. Americans are, if you compare us today with people 50 years ago, Americans are twice as rich, we're more healthy, we're more youthful, we're really safer, but we're not as happy. It says since the 1960s, the percentage of Americans who say they're very unhappy has risen by 20%. Did you catch that? Since the 1960s, up by 20%. So we're not talking about some insignificant amount, 20%. And depression rates are 10 times higher than the 1950s. Here's another statistic. Each year, 15% of Americans, now that's a large chunk of people, suffer from an anxiety disorder. And so there was a University of Pennsylvania psychologist, I guess he's a researcher that deals with happiness. And he had a study that he released in 1988 that Moreland said sent shockwaves around the country. So what did he do? He studied the happiness quotient and depression rate among Americans at that time compared to the grandparents and parents and great-grandparents and all. So here's what he discovered. The loss of happiness and the rise of depression was tenfold in the span of one generation. Something obviously has gone wrong with our culture, said this University of Pennsylvania psychologist. His name is Martin Seligman. And so he's trying to figure out what is going on with that. You know, why are we just booming when it comes to depression and anxiety and things like that? Moreland says, you know, we would be naive if we didn't think this epidemic was affecting all of us. Yeah. And so he's pointing forward in this book. He said, there's a way out of this mess. And he says the chapters that follow are my best offerings for embarking on a journey to end up with a good, deep, rich, satisfying life. And he said, I'd like you to read this book as my invitation to you for such a life, one that has drama and adventure, it has meaning, it has purpose. And he said, we need to start. He said, we need to find out what are these causes and symptoms of this cultural crisis, things getting richer in the material world, but we're getting poorer when it comes to happiness and things like that. So he said, he read a book. It was called, I don't know if the title is here, but a book by a psychologist, Edmund Bourne, Bourne, identified 3 causes for this rise in depression and anxiety. Number 1, the pace of modern life. Number 2, the loss of a sense of community and deep connectedness with others. And number 3, the emergence of moral relativism. So let's just pick up on those 3 as JP is going to do here. So he said, the sheer pace that we live. He said, we hear terms like rush hour, hurry up, fast food. He said, all of that stuff. He said, we're just adrenaline junkies all the time. It's hard to settle down and be quiet and hear from ourselves. He said, our brain chemistry isn't normal because we've got all this adrenaline charging through our system. And we're not capable of handling the stress of ordinary contemporary life. Number 2, what was the second problem? Loss of community. What do we have? The Western world, and I'm capitalizing the W, the West, United States and Canada and England. So the Western world has really strong emphasis on individualism. And JP points out that's a good thing in moderation. But we have individualism that's gone mad. And we're so busy, we don't cultivate deep friendships. We've got misplaced priorities. And then the third issue, he said, was the moral relativism that these authors pointed out. Well, Bourne is the one that pointed it out. And here's what he said. There's no shared, consistent, socially agreed upon set of values and standards for people to live by. In the vacuum left, most of us attempt to fend for ourselves. And then I'm skipping ahead to, this is still quoting about this moral relativism. We are left with the responsibility of having to create our own meaning and moral order. And when we can't do that, this author said, we're prone to fill a gap that's left with escapism and addiction. He said, we live out of tune with ourselves and thus we find ourselves anxious. So that's Bourne talking about this moral relativism. He said, think about this, moral relativism. It has to do with tolerance, doesn't it? That it's good to be tolerant. He said, I want to talk about that for a minute. He said the classic principle of tolerance is great. We're supposed to take another group's view to be wrong and harmful, let's say, but we treat the people that we don't agree with respect, and we defend their right to promote their views. But what's happened now? Well, you can't say anybody else's behavior is wrong. He said that's immoral. That allows for genuine evil, things like racism, child molestation. JP says we've got to judge the behavior to be evil before we can stop it. It's cold and heartless, too, isn't it, if you think about it? So somebody else is doing something in a lifestyle that you know is flawed and it's going to wreck that person. What should we be doing? We should help that person face this and get out of that lifestyle. But look at the contemporary tolerance idea. We're just all indifferent. We don't have the moral vision to intervene in the life of somebody else and try to help them. So at this point, Moreland says, let's summarize the insights. First, we don't have depression and we have depression and anxiety because of the pace of our lives. Number 2, we don't have good relational connections with others for support. And number 3, we don't have the intellectual framework to admit that there's a right and a wrong way to approach life. So he says there are the 3 things. He said, maybe you should sit down. I like this because he interacts with the readers if you're sitting with JP. He said, it wouldn't hurt if you set the book down now and took out a piece of paper and jot down those 3 factors. So 1 is the pace of our lives. Number 2, the lack of connections we have with others. And the moral framework to call something right or wrong. He said, why don't you jot down those 3 factors and brainstorm about how they've impacted your life or your loved ones in a negative way. Well, that would be pretty powerful, I would think. But JP says, I want to go deeper than this. He said, yeah, those 3 things. He said, I think that really has hurt our lives. But he said, there are three, let's see, it's going to be two more things that he said has kind of messed with us. And one is, he calls it hurry, and the second one is worry. So he said, people are afraid to slow down and be quiet. He said, we fear solitude today. We fear not having anything to do. We're afraid of what's going to happen if we aren't busy. What do we fear? We worry that our anxiety is going to bubble up. We dread feeling insignificant. Our busyness and our hurried lives are ways to avoid that. And then he said, we got worry. He said, we have something much deeper, though. He said, there are big things to worry about, certainly, right? Things like losing a job or dying and things like that. But he said, he's talking about worry as an approach to life. It's like a learned behavior. And he said his mom, he loved his mom, but he said she was a very anxious person who worried about everything. And he said, I had lived around her and absorbed her approach to life. He said, when I became an adult, he said, I learned how to worry from an expert. And he said, now I became the expert. He said, so what roles do hurry and worry play in your life? So here he is asking the reader again to get involved. He said, spend some time pondering this question. He said, find some safe friends or a family member and just ask the person, give me some feedback. He said, one of our main fears is boredom and loneliness. And if you're full of hurry and worry, then you don't have to face those fears. I think he makes a good point there. He said, it takes a lot of energy to live this busy, worry-filled life. He said, we're vulnerable to addictions. So he said, there are a lot more addictions than drugs. He said, it might be social recognition, alcohol, maybe it's eating, maybe it's just buying and selling. And so he says, we shrivel as real people, and we lose touch with ourselves. So now he does summaries, and JP has always been good about that. He did that when he came to our church. He will pause in the middle of whatever he's doing and run through the points to make sure people are clear on it before he moves on. So he does that at this point. He said, let's summarize. So he said, at least the last 40 years, we're not finding happiness. He said, we're more depressed, we're more anxious than ever. He said, we've got the fast pace of life, we've lost a sense of community, we've had this emergence of moral relativism, so we can't judge anything right or wrong anymore. And he said, digging more deeply, he said, we find it hard to face our real, authentic emotional pain, and so instead, what do? What do we substitute for that? Hurry and worry. He said that allows us to cope with our boredom without having to face our true situation. And then he kind of like looks ahead and tells you where he's going with this book. He said, beginning with the second chapter, I'm going to mention the G word, God. He says more specifically the Christian God and Jesus of Nazareth. So he said, whenever we focus on having a good, rich life and why some of us are unhappy, he said, you get into broad questions about the meaning of life. And he said, and that's the way it should be. And when you start asking those big questions, somewhere in there is going to be the question about God. JP says he's heard that the single most important thing about a person is what comes to mind when he or she hears that word, God. He said, so why am I concerned? Because he said, it's really hard to invite someone in the culture to give the topic a fresh hearing. He said, here's one audience, right? Maybe the person is not a follower of Jesus. And it said, you might have picked up this book or something. And he said, you may feel defensive about it. He said, you may feel somebody's trying to fix you or win you in an argument about Christianity. He said, I understand the defensiveness. He said, but to be honest, if you're concerned about that, you're not being true to yourself. You're letting others control you. He said, be yourself. Think for yourself. Give me a hearing. And when you've read the entire book, step back and decide for yourself what you think about it. So I like that a lot. A good challenge, but a nice challenge to the reader. So he said, he's talked to atheists and agnostics for 40 years. And he said, he said, I have a deeper concern about your defensiveness when it comes to Christianity. He said, many people don't want God to exist. So it's not that they've come up with intellectual reasons, but it's often just personal reasons. And he has a quote here from philosopher Thomas Nagel. I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Well, I thought that was really refreshing to hear a person be willing to say that. In other words, the evidence has not won him over. It's just his personal will. He doesn't want to acknowledge and bend the knee to think there would be a God. But he said, approaching life that way is hard to sustain. Now, that's JP talking. He said, here's a young atheist named Douglas Copeland. He said, listen to what he has to say. So here's an atheist talking. Now, here's my secret. I tell it to you with the openness of heart that I doubt I shall ever achieve again. So I pray that you're in a quiet room as you hear these words. My secret is that I need God, that I'm sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem capable of giving, to help me be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness, to help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. Isn't that something? That's really powerful. So he said, the question comes out, so why are people atheists? And he said, well, for some, he said, this is really a big deal. You may have had a problem with your own father figure. JP has spoken on hundreds of college campuses in more than 40 states, and he said it's clear to him, talking to people, that atheists have deep-seated, often have, not always, but often have deep-seated unresolved emotional conflicts with their father figure. He said that plays a role in their atheism. He said, let's be honest, you owe it to yourself. Is this causing you to be defensive about the topic of God? He said, I urge you in the safety of a conversation to follow. Try to set this aside. But he said, there's a second reason you may not want the Christian God to be real. People want to be liberated from traditional morality so they can do whatever they want sexually. That'll leave them without any guilt, shame, or condemnation. And he has a quote from Aldous Huxley, very famous atheist, who wrote Brave New World. Here's what Huxley had to say. I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning. Consequently, I assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. For myself, as no doubt for most of my contemporaries, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation. So now he explains what he means by liberation. Liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. So JP says, you may have hostility to God if you have a vested interest in wanting to deal with pornography or engage in sexual activity outside of traditional marriage. He said, you want a no-guilt zone. He said, I take no pleasure in saying this. He said, I'm not trying to be harsh or judgmental. So then he says, my first concern, he says, about defensiveness, then, is due to the role that unresolved father issues and maybe sexual practices could play in preventing people from facing this topic honestly. But he said there's a second concern, too. It's the associations that come to mind when people in our culture think of conservative Christians, most of whom would be called evangelicals. It says you may see red at the very thought of Christians. Oh, yeah, Christians, they're the hypocrites, they're the intolerant bigots, they're the nosy members of the religious right. They're trying to tell others what to do and how to think. Christians are irrational, unscientific, non-thinking sorts who will gullibly believe anything. Now, he quotes from Robert Reich, who was involved, I think, in Clinton's administration, UC Berkeley professor, former Secretary of Labor. Here's what Reich had to say. Just think about what he's saying here about Christians in particular. The great conflict of the 21st century will not be between the West and terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic, not a belief. The true battle will be between those who believe in the primacy of the individual and those who believe that human beings owe their allegiance and identity to a higher authority, between those who give priority to life in this world and those who believe that human life is mere preparation for an existence beyond life, between those who believe in science, reason, and logic, and those who believe that truth is revealed through scripture and religious dogma. Terrorism will disrupt and destroy lives, but terrorism itself is not the greatest danger we face. So JP says, Reich needs to lighten up a bit. He said, you may share his opinion about what people think of when it comes to Christians. He said, how about two counter-arguments? He said, first, Reich's comments and the description of Christians, he said, those are caricatures. It's a cultural lie that the more educated you become, the more you reject Christianity. I think that's interesting to know. A few years ago, a sociologist published a study of the impact of contemporary culture on American evangelicalism. And here's the conclusion. Self-identified evangelicals have more years of education than fundamentalists, liberals, Roman Catholics, and those who are non-religious. Of all groups, evangelicals are the least likely to have only a high school education or less. The non-religious are the most likely. Furthermore, higher proportions of evangelicals have studied at the graduate school level than have fundamentalists, liberals, or the non-religious. Wow. He says, yeah, there are some bigoted eggs in our basket, but he said, don't judge the whole basket. He said, even if this bad picture of Christians has more than a small grain of truth, becoming a follower of Jesus doesn't have to make you like this. He said, the real issue is whether the Christian God is real and can be known, whether Jesus of Nazareth was really the very Son of God, and whether the movement he started is what you need and have been looking for, whether it's consciously or not. So he said, at the end of the day, the issue is not whether Christians are hypocrites, Republicans, or whatever. The issue is Jesus of Nazareth and your life. So I will end there at that point. I'm only partway through this first chapter, but I like it. He's laying the groundwork before he gets into answering particulars about Christianity. JP is a thorough thinker, a careful writer, and I know you'd like anything that he puts out. Well, thank you for being part of this podcast. And I guess I'll do the second part next time because I hate to stop halfway through a chapter. So anyway, we'll come back to this again. Thanks.